Part 4, Jumpstarting the Dialectic of Recognition. But there are other theorists who are not quite so ready to put the narrative of liberation to rest. George Ciccariello Maher, for one, in his 2017 book, Decolonizing Dialectics, who makes ample use of Fanonian lessons of precisely the kind that Scott would condemn to the past, in order to illuminate the contours and clarify the stakes of a variety of contemporary struggles for self-determination, ranging from the movement for Black lives in the United States to the battle for socialism in Venezuela. Ciccariello Maher takes inspiration from the revolutionary life and work of Fanon, whom he considers a kindred spirit, while managing to acquit himself quite convincingly of Scott's postmodern charge of indulging in a late modern romance of nostalgia, even as he unequivocally urges a return to the barricades. Ciccariello Maher brings into focus the centrality and continuing relevance of the call to combative confrontation, the articulation of a decolonized dialectic of revolutionary struggle by Fanon. By dialectics, Ciccariello Maher means the dynamic movement of conflictive oppositions. In two successive chapters dedicated to Fanon's two most influential books, his 1952 Black Skins, White Masks and his 1961 Wretched of the Earth, respectively, Ciccariello Maher elaborates a quite persuasive case for the lessons to be learned from an unabashedly liberationist reading of Fanon as a decolonizing dialectician. In a chapter titled Towards a New Dialectics of Race, Ciccariello Maher skillfully sketches a portrait of Fanon as a man driven repeatedly backward, forced to seek a new outlet for his humanity in combative rupture. As Ciccariello Maher insightfully frames Fanon's response to his predicament, knowing full well the irrationality of race, he was left with no alternative but recognition. Ciccariello Maher depicts Fanon as determined to forge ahead to reformulate and ultimately decolonize Hegel's dialectic of lord and bondsman, master and slave, all too aware of the need for violent self-assertion by those racialized as Black to stand the chance to escape from the zone of non-being to which they have been condemned by a racist order. In Ciccariello Maher's felicitous turn of phrase, for equality to be contemplated, for recognition to even appear on the horizon, racialized subjects must first storm the fortified heaven of being itself. Ciccariello Maher is at pains to emphasize, contra the charge of teleology leveled by the likes of Scott against the narrative of liberation as articulated by Fanon, that in fact, Fanon's version of decolonized dialectics is a dialectic stripped of all certainty. It is a dialectics that effectively centers the radical assertion of Black identity in the present at the expense of all determinism, teleology, and preemptive reconciliation. The ontological violence entailed in processes of racialization must be met with counter-violence. As Ciccariello Maher eloquently puts the point, for the racialized subject, self-consciousness as human requires counter-violence against ontological force. In a historical situation marked by the denial of reciprocity and condemnation to non-being, that reciprocity can only result from the combative self-assertion of identity. It is only through such conflict that Black subjects can transcend the barriers, internal and external, that exclude them from the fullness of being, at the juncture of the in itself and the for itself. The task of this violence is therefore twofold. Internally, to disalienate the Black subject, even prior to any physically violent act, by turning away from the master, and externally to appear, which will inevitably be perceived as violence to the prevailing system, a perception that is itself necessary for appearance to become violence to that system, and for the former master to eventually turn toward the former slave for recognition. But for Ciccariello Maher, Fanon's contribution is not limited to the discovery against Hegel that a decolonized dialectic needs to be jump-started to overcome an absence of reciprocity from the outset. Instead, Fanon would also come soon to foresee several further dangers looming on the horizon that threaten to deactivate and short-circuit what had scarcely been set in motion. Prominent among these, a problem Ciccariello Maher stresses that still very much plagues us today, is the false universal posed by formal emancipation and formal equality. Ciccariello Maher contends that Fanon could see how emancipation and formal equality, more broadly speaking, reinforced ontological hierarchy by masking it beneath a false universalism that became white supremacy's best alibi. But from a dialectical perspective, Ciccariello Maher continues, for this alibi to function on both the objective and subjective levels, for it to deactivate struggles and freeze dialectical movement at the level of the merely formal, something essential must have been lacking from the emancipation process itself. That something was struggle. Indeed, to this end, Fanon draws upon the centrality of Hegel, the centrality Hegel ascribes to struggle for subjective transformation as leverage to insist that freedom cannot be given, but must instead be fought for. Another crucial problem that Fanon foresees, which again speaks to the radically uncertain, non-teleological nature of Fanon's liberationist narrative, is the danger of a premature and Eurocentric closure of the dialectic. This he distills from his confrontation with the great existentialist philosopher Sartre, who had penned what was on the surface an adulatory preface titled Black Orpheus for an anthology of African and Caribbean poets edited by Leopold Senghor. In the preface, Sartre had applauded the negritude movement and interpreted its appearance on the scene as a moment in a progressive movement towards human emancipation in which its necessary particularism, its single-minded focus on race, was destined to be subsumed within the allegedly universal category of class and dynamic of class struggle. Negritude appears, writes Sartre, as a minor moment of a dialectical progression. The theoretical and practical affirmation of white supremacy is the thesis, the position of negritude as the antithetical value is the moment of negativity, but this negative moment is not sufficient in itself, and these blacks who use it know this perfectly well. They know that it aims at preparing the synthesis or realization of the human in a raceless society. Sartre then goes on to conclude that negritude is thus for destroying itself. It is a passage and not an outcome, a means and not an ultimate end. Fanon interprets this argument by his erstwhile comrade Sartre as more than mere condescension. He interprets it as outright betrayal. This born Hegelian, retorts Fanon, in reference to Sartre, had forgotten that consciousness needs to lose itself in the night of the absolute, the only condition for attaining self-consciousness. Ciccariello Maher deciphers this somewhat enigmatic response by highlighting the open-endedness of Fanon's own approach, indeed, the radical unpredictability of Fanon's dialectics. He contends that Fanon is here accusing Sartre of undialectically having forgotten that no dialectic can operate in a preordained manner without short-circuiting the very process itself. For after all, in the case at hand, why would someone embrace an identity already deemed transitory from the outset? Fanon, Ciccariello Maher concludes, was utterly devastated by Sartre's undialectical betrayal. Not yet white, no longer black, I was damned, Fanon would write, thereby stumbling upon the very concept for which he would become most famous, that of the damné, the condemned, or the wretched of his last book, for which a repentant Sartre would himself pen the preface. If Fanon, unlike Sartre, is therefore adamant in his insistence upon the open-ended, uncertain nature of the outcome of the struggle, he nevertheless converges with Sartre in his existentialist emphasis on the theme of liberation as self-creation. In the world I am heading for, Fanon would insist, I am endlessly creating myself. But whereas in Black Skin, White Masks, Fanon's focus is on the process of individual disalienation and self-realization, by the time he came to write The Wretched of the Earth in the last months of his life, Fanon had come to believe that individual disalienation meant little in a profoundly sick world where everyday reality is a tissue of lies, of cowardice, of contempt for man. Accordingly, in 1956, he had resigned from his post as at the head of the psychiatric hospital of Blaida Joinville in colonial Algeria, a post he had taken up in 1953, and had embraced instead the full-throttled commitment to the life of a revolutionary, ensconced in Algeria's anti-colonial struggle. The Wretched of the Earth, though it is much more than that, is undoubtedly most famous for its first chapter concerning violence, in which Fanon defends the armed struggle against the colonizer, justifying the generative power of anti-colonial counter-violence as a cleansing force capable of hardening decolonial national identity and making possible the leap from a frozen Manichaeism to a properly dialectical logic of dynamic oppositions, generating not merely the rupture of the existing, but also a process of open-ended transformation toward a new decolonized universal, as Ciccariello Maher depicts it. In a word, Fanon sees such violence as the essential precondition for national identity in the colonial context, standing at the very center of the dialectic of decolonization as its only source of motion. Again, Fanon is quick to emphasize the centrality of struggle. Through the struggle, the people realize that life is an endless combat, and that combat is no more and no less than the motor force of an equally endless dialectics. The uncertain, open-ended nature of Fanon's dialectic is again most apparent. For as Fanon lay dying, he glimpsed a new danger looming that threatened to halt the motion and close off the emergence of national consciousness. The danger was a dual one. threatening to trap the young nation within the simplistic nationalism that had been its initial motor, while harnessing it globally into the neo-colonial continuity of the capitalist world system. A dual danger which, in turn, leads him to project his dialectic outward onto the global plane. Even so, as Ciccariello Maher insists, Fanon's leap to the global is not characterized by an immediate embrace of the universal. Far from it, he displaces analysis to the global level at the same time that he defers the universal even further into the future, deepening the oppositions at the heart of a global dialectics while insisting on the indeterminate open-endedness of that process. Moreover, Ciccariello Maher continues, Fanon concludes wretched with a striking condemnation of mimicry that has powerfully dialectical implications. For Fanon, with Europe as antithesis and humanity marking a distant universal horizon, the only path forward is ourselves. The revolutionary assertion of decolonial identity emerging from the zone of non-being to press the dialectic into motion. This, Ciccariello Maher concludes, is a decolonized global dialectic that walks the fine line between essentialism and the universal, recognizing both European accomplishments and European crimes. Such a decolonized dialectic effectively displaces the narrow European dialectic by way of a decolonial turn in which the national unit of analysis is no longer sufficient, if it ever was, while the decolonial nation assumes an oppositional position within the broader unit of analysis that is the global colonial totality of the world system. If the European workers began the revolution, it is the colonized masses who must complete it. Back to the future. Nor is Ciccariello Maher alone in reivindicating the continuing relevance of a revolutionary reading of Fanon for struggles for self-determination today. Indeed, the indigenous activist and scholar Glenn Coulthard from the Denis Nation similarly draws militant lessons from Fanon in relation to the struggle for indigenous resurgence in Canada, as embodied in the Idle No More movement. He does so in his groundbreaking 2015 book, evocatively titled Redskins, White Masks, Rejecting the Colonial Politics of Recognition, where he takes aim at liberal multicultural forms of settler colonial accommodation and recognition for indigenous groups, as perhaps most famously framed in the work of the political philosopher Charles Taylor. Like Ciccariello Maher, Coulthard stresses the continuing importance for colonized and racialized groups of Fanon's emphasis on the need for militant self-affirmation and determined struggle. To this end, Coulthard claims that Fanon's critique of Hegel's theory of recognition convincingly unpacks the ways in which delegated exchanges of political recognition from the colonizer to the colonized usually ends up being structurally determined by and in the interests of the colonizer. Coulthard goes on to contend that Fanon remains crucial also insofar as he identifies the subtle ways in which colonized populations often come to develop what he called psychoaffective attachments to these circumscribed, master-sanctioned forms of delegated recognition. For Fanon, Coulthard insists, these psychoaffective or ideological attachments create an impression of naturalness to the colonial condition, which he referred to as internalization or internalized colonialism. Nevertheless, Coulthard contends, Fanon showed how colonized populations, despite the totalizing power of colonialism, are often able to turn these internalized forms of colonial recognition into expressions of indigenous self-empowerment through the reclamation and revitalization of pre-colonial social relations and cultural traditions. Even so, unlike Ciccariello Maher, Coulthard ultimately thinks that the indigenous struggle needs to go beyond the dialectical framework provided by Fanon. Indeed, Coulthard accuses Fanon of remaining too close to Sartre in viewing practices of indigenous cultural self-empowerment or self-recognition as insufficient for decolonization, as constituting a means but not an end. In Coulthard's words, Fanon clearly shared Sartre's view that negritude's emphasis on cultural self-affirmation constituted an important means but not an ultimate end of anti-colonial struggle, even though both authors arrived at this analogous conclusion via different paths. In fact, as Coulthard suggests, although Fanon saw the critical reevaluation of indigenous cultural forms as an important means of temporarily breaking the colonized free from the incapacitating effects of being exposed to structured patterns of colonial misrecognition, he was decidedly less willing to explore the role that these forms and practices might play in the construction of alternatives to the oppressive social relations that produce colonized subjects in the first place. For this reason, Coulthard concludes, When Fanon reprimands Sartre for characterizing the self-affirmative reconstruction of Black subjectivity as a phase in the unfolding dialectic of anti-colonial class struggle, he is challenging Sartre's deterministic understanding of the dialectic, not his claim that this process represents a stage in a broader struggle for freedom and equality. Or to put the point even more forcefully, although Fanon eschews an evolutionary anthropological theory of historical development in which societies are viewed as developing along a linear path from primitive to civilized, he remains wedded to a dialectical conception of social transformation that privileges the new over the old. In sum, according to Coulthard, this view simply does not provide much insight into either what motivates indigenous resistance to settler colonization or into the cultural foundations upon which indigenous non-colonial alternatives might be constructed. Coulthard thus, unlike Scott, would hold on to the militant revolutionary nature of the emancipatory narrative articulated by Fanon, but unlike Ciccariello Maher, he would at the same time radically question that narrative's reliance on a dialectical conception of social transformation that privileges the new over the old. Conclusion. Let us therefore conclude. In this lecture, we have sought to explore the lessons and legacy of anti-colonial world-making as the implications and limits of such 20th century projects have been profoundly examined in the important recent books by Adam Gadachew and Gary Wilder. We have furthermore contemplated the possibility that the narrative of liberation associated with the radical projects of anti-imperialist self-determination should be considered by now hopelessly passé. We did so by engaging with David Scott's skillful depiction and critique of this narrative as articulated in the canonical work of Frantz Fanon, and by contrasting Scott's approach to Fanon to the more militant readings provided by George Ciccariello Maher and Glenn Coulthard, both of whose scholarship is unabashedly and organically linked to a variety of contemporary struggles for decolonization and self-determination, ranging from the movements for Black lives and for indigenous resurgence in North America to the ongoing struggle for socialism inflected by the imperative for a decolonial turn in Latin America. All right, thank you.